Great Wednesday. Welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined today with my co-host, Reggie. Reggie, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, King. It's always good on Wednesday morning to both anticipate and then realize our conversation. So I'm doing well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so why don't we get started with what would you say your gratitude moment today is?
So I remain grateful for indoor plumbing and a working refrigerator with mostly fresh food in it. I know that's a blessing that many people on the planet don't have. But beyond that, I'm grateful today just for I get to get up every morning and do work that I care deeply about, whether it's conversations with you, whether it's coaching my clients, whether it's marketing a new book. Actually, the marketing on that it's not my favorite thing. I like writing books more, but I say that's tongue in cheek because I'm just grateful that I got to sit and write what I care about. So I feel really blessed across the board, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of what I feel grateful for. So, how about you?
Excellent. Well, again, I'm grateful for my life, health, my ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have sound mind. Another 24 hours to pursue my purpose, roof over my head, a mother who's alive and sound mind, of kind spirit. And I'm also grateful for, again, I've said this before, but the problems I have, because I believe that so much to be learned from problems. Yeah. And one of the problems I'm experiencing right now, and it keeps rearing its head, is how folks will agree to things and then without conveying to me they've changed their mind, they would just ghost me.
Okay.
And I'm looking for the solution in that. I know there's some energy in that I need to unpack. And I know that's within me because it's consistently happening with the folks I meet. These are not people I've known for years. These are new people. Mm-hmm. And so some energy I'm emitting that's causing that. And I know that once I solve that, then my life will switch to a different level. I would transcend to a different level, which is one of the 10 spiritual commandments of spiritual capitalism. Yeah. And so I'm thankful for that challenge, that problem, because as I begin to peel back those layers, like I said, I'm looking forward to the person I want to become as a result of discovering what that is.
Yeah. And if it's okay, I just want to comment really quickly because the way you unpacked that, so there's these people that make a commitment or say they're going to do something and then they kind of ghost you. And rather than, the conventional move is to figure out what's going on with them and blame them and point the finger. And you turned it back in and say, okay, that's a problem that you need to navigate inside of yourself. And if everybody on the planet could just make that one move to take that responsibility, regardless of what it looks like out there, I think we'd all be in a better place. So I love that you presented it that way. I hope I didn't misconstrue what you said, but
no,
that's how I received it. Yeah.
No, you're spot on. I mean, my belief is, zero victim mentality. And I believe that because you can only change you. See, if I said it was them, I can't change them. Yeah. Then I will sit around myself and constantly blame everyone else, and then not understanding that there's something about my energy that I need to deal with and timing. Yeah. And there's a lesson there. And I believe that for me, as a growth-minded individual, we always got to seek ways to grow. And every challenge that we see in our lives, some people might call them problems. Mm-hmm. I call them challenges, because even that's a perspective to look at, because challenges are meant to be overcome. Yeah. Problems sometimes can just be lived with. And I refuse to live with this as a problem, more as a challenge. And once I figure out the solution, then I know that I've transcended myself. So I look forward to that growth potential. Yeah. But thank you for recognizing that.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, that's where to use a horrible old tire commercial cliche, I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So lots happened since we had our last show. Yep. So I'm excited to learn kind of the direction you want to talk about today, and kind of, if you wouldn't mind, set the context for us.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. So again, for folks who might be tuning in for the first time, we're speaking about a new book which came out in October, Healing America's Narratives. The subtitle is "The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow." It just takes a look at kind of the parts of the United States of America that we don't see on a regular basis, or that we kind of might know are kind of there, but we deny that they're true. And I won't review what we've already done, but today, for a variety of reasons, in chapter 8 of the book, I review 6 or 7 topics that each didn't get their own chapter in the book, examples of American shadow. And one of them, which is present throughout each of the big histories we explore, which again, I'll say them: the history of women, the history of Native Americans, the history of African Americans, the Vietnam War, and post 9/11 war on terror. What I refer to as our American culture of violence is present in all 5 of those. And I also believe that it exists as a separate underlying element of our shadow. And as you and I both know, this past Friday, we're in November of, I know this isn't good for evergreening, but we're in November of 2022, and this past Friday, there was a shooting at Club Q, a 2S LGBTQIA plus club in Colorado Springs, where 5 people were killed and some 20 some odd were injured by a shooter. And then just last night in Virginia, a shooter killed at least 6 people in a Walmart. And this is the day before our National Thanksgiving. So the culture of violence is the air that we breathe, and I believe the water that we swim in. And if you take even a cursory look at the history of the United States, you cannot be surprised by that. In other words, if you're relatively honest and moderately competent middle schooler or older, and you look at the history of the country, violence is everywhere. Now, not only violence, there's other things and there are positive things, but the history of the culture of violence is present. So if it's okay, I want to just read several sentences from the book that provide, in about 5 or 6 sentences, just a real clear overview of how we were conceived as a nation, how we were born, how we were reborn several times, and how violence was present throughout all of that. So is that all right? I'm just going to read a couple of sentences.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for those of you following along at home, this is from chapter 11. It's on page 325. So I'm going to just read from the book. So as a nation, America remains an experiment. We were conceived through the fertilization of ideas that gave voice to some and subjugated others. Parenthetically, I'm referring obviously to the Founding Fathers and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence. We were born through a bloodbath that pitted Brit against Brit on land stolen from indigenous peoples and developed by kidnapped Africans. We were raised on enslavement, land and property theft, massacre, betrayal, and peasant labor. We were reborn in an attempt to maintain the experiment through an anything but civil bloodbath with ourselves, referring to the war between the states, from which we have yet to fully recover. And we were reborn yet again as a financial and military superpower as a result of a global bloodbath. We regularly perpetrate and perpetuate violence against others while refusing to acknowledge and address in any effective way the everyday violence we commit against ourselves. So that's just the piece I wanted to read. Approximately 100 to 103 Americans die every day just from gunshot wounds, about 2/3 of those are suicides, and about 1/3 of those suicides are military veterans, combat veterans. But every day, put the mass shootings aside, and we have enough of those. Every day, about 100 Americans die as a result of gunshot wounds. And then a lot of others die violently due to other means. So the culture itself is violent. Millions, that's probably an exaggeration, many Americans who face difficulties in their lives have not figured out how to resolve the difficulties other than through violence, whether it's violence directed at themselves through suicide, or violence directed at others for whatever reason. And there are many reasons that everyday shootings and mass shootings take place. So that's just, we're almost immune to that because it happens so frequently. And then the last thing I'll say before I be quiet is one of the striking examples of that. And I almost don't like speaking about this, but it really struck me. In last year's Academy, or actually this year's Academy Awards, when one famous entertainer came up on the stage and slapped another entertainer, it was Will Smith and Chris Rock, both of whom I have great respect for in terms of their professional lives. I mean, they're both really good at what they do, in my experience. And for the next 48 hours, American news, American social media, everything lit up about the fact that one guy, a millionaire, famous, slapped another guy, a millionaire, famous, in the face on stage. Meanwhile, outside in Los Angeles and in the rest of the country, 103 other Americans were going to, approximately 103, were going to die from gunshot wounds. And we only pay attention when the next violent mass shooting happens. But we were willing to give 48 hours or more of attention to a celebrity slap. Because that was news. That was, wow, it was violence on stage at the Academy Awards. And it was,
right.
Come on, so that was it just struck me the difference. What we as Americans pay attention to. And that's exacerbated by the media and social media, left and right, who thought that was a big story and needed to be reported on and investigated. But not, how many shootings occurred in Chicago that same evening,
right,
or anywhere else in the country. So it's we live in this violence, and we tend to make believe it's not true,
or it's not as bad. Our tolerance for violence has grown immensely. And to your point, as you outline in your book, America was pretty much built off violence.
Yeah.
So that's at the very core of our DNA as a country is violence. And we're seeing the manifestations of that throughout the generations since then, to the point now where, like in my community I live in now, mass shootings aside, daily, someone gets shot here in Baltimore City. If not multiple people get shot. Then you hear, the tragic stories of, I was having this discussion with a colleague of mine. She said, did you hear about the little girl who got shot? And I said, no, I thought it was a little boy. No, a little boy got shot yesterday. This is a little girl that got shot. Okay. So, that's a real conversation. That's how common gunplay and gun violence is. And so now you become desensitized to even children die, because now we're not even shocked at the fact that, there's still some shock there, but it's not at the level of, wow. It's just, well, I thought it was a little girl. No, it was a little boy, et cetera. Yeah. And then, of course, you talked about media. The media just perpetuates violence. Like the media never shows you, or if they do show, it's rare that it actually gets talked about. Example of let's say, for example, a police officer actually saving someone and doing a good deed, you would think it doesn't exist at all, right? It never gets talked about, So the only time the police get talked about is in the context of doing something negative or some kind of corruption. So that's the atmosphere. And then, of course, within my community, we believe police are corrupt to the core. Not all police, obviously, but if you just want to say police, you don't say corruption next to it. And say it's probably more corruption than there are less corrupt cops. That's what we believe. Not to say that's true, but that's what I'm saying. That's a perception that the community has. So now, with that being said, I think it goes back to, again, in my journey toward personal growth and self-mastery, the books that I read, one of the books that's really present in my mind right now and in my consciousness is the book by Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And he talks about how having meaning in your life changes your life. And see, now we talk about that in the context of mass shootings. I think that the violence and the rhetoric that's put out there from the political left and right is putting meaning in people's minds. That gives that person who decides to be a shooter meaning that they didn't have before. And that meaning then creates that action and produces that, because now they feel as though, well, I have to go out here and do this because this resonates with me. And I believe this ideology. I believe this rhetoric that's being said in this particular community, whether it's the LGBTQ community, whether it's a Latino community, whether it's a Black community, whether it's a Jewish community, whatever community is the recipient of this violence, somebody has took meaning to the fact that they have to go and do something as meaning in their life of destruction in that context. And I think the only way we're going to actually begin to start shifting, and and I love this analogy Obama gave when he was a president, and he talked about when he got in office, that making he's referred to as it relates to the economy, but I'm referring to it as it relates to this change in our culture of violence you talk about, is that we can't just hit a quick U-turn and go in the opposite direction. It's like we have an ocean liner and we have to make small incremental changes. And before you do it, you start to realize you're going in a different direction. And to me, those small incremental changes that we have to make, it's going to be seeing each other as human beings and not seeing each other as political opponents, as Republicans and Democrats, as Jews, as Blacks, as gays, as any of these labels we put on. That's why I advocate we have to get away from this labeling, because the labeling now creates divisiveness, and then we're stuck in these tribes, and everybody says, well, my tribe, and you talk about this in the book again, as well as an individualistic thinking, my tribe is better, and I have to go out here and kill on behalf of my tribe.
Yeah. I've, as you know, I mean, that's my bias. I have what I call developmental bias, and most of the horrible things, and we'll just stay in the United States for now, but it's true around the world, happen at what I refer to as a group-centric worldview, where it's my group against another group or all other groups, and until we develop as individuals, and development is real. It's research, like adult developmental worldviews. There's about 50 years of research in it now. Briefly, that can be me-centric. It's just about me. Group-centric. It's about my group or my groups. And that could be everything from my family to my religion to my political party to my sports team. It can be kind of goofy and superficial. It can be really important. Not that sports teams aren't important to some people. But the next move, and that's the one that you referred to, is the one, that person is a human being too. We're the same species. So I call that, it's about all of us. So it's a human, group. And so, once you have approximately, I think we just hit the 8 billion mark officially in the last week or so. And once you say, even somebody from some other country whose culture I don't understand and whose language I don't understand, same species. All right. What could I learn from them? What could I share with them? We don't do that. We say, look at them. They're different. Let's enslave them, kidnap them, take their land, or bomb them. I mean, that's basically been the I mean, that's a gross oversimplification, but it's not inaccurate. And so one of the more striking things that I learned while I was writing the book, and there were several, but when I was doing the research on the Vietnam War, and I may have mentioned this in a previous conversation we had, but Neil Sheehan, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize winning book, A Bright Shining Lie about that war, when he wrote about the My Lai massacre, where a platoon of army soldiers one morning killed 500 civilians,
Wow.
300 of whom were in My Lai, a small village, and the rest of them were in a larger region, that My Lai was part of. And Sheehan wrote that the reason that the soldiers at My Lai were seen as doing something wrong was they made the mistake of killing that many people in a short period of time, one morning, close range with handguns, rifles, and machine guns. If they had killed the same number of people over several weeks or a month using artillery, bombs, and napalm, it would have just been business as usual in killing the Vietnamese. So what he wrote was the soldiers on the ground became immune to seeing the Vietnamese people as human, because that's what their government leaders and their military leaders showed them, because they just bombed them every day and just killed indiscriminately every day. So these Vietnamese people, were no longer seen as human. So Sheehan wrote that the American government and military leadership made the My Lai massacre inevitable. He said, based on how they conducted the war at large, a massacre like that was inevitable because of the dehumanization of the Vietnamese. I would argue that if you look honestly at the history of the United States, how we live in the third decade of the 21st century, if you're a teacher or a student, you know what an active shooter drill is. Every school in the country practices active shooter drills, what to do in case there's going to be a shooter in your building. You didn't have to do that. I didn't have to do that. When I was a kid, we had to duck and cover to protect our heads from a nuclear blast, which was, in hindsight, kind of goofy, and never happened. But this is very real. So any restaurant, any concert, any club, any movie theater, anywhere can be the site of the next active shooter in this country. And I argue that's absolutely inevitable if you look at the history of the country, because the violence has always been how we got things done. Not only violence, again, there's some good things in this country, but we're speaking about the shadow of the United States, the hidden part that we make believe or don't know is there.
Right.
So that's a scary thought, that our violence is inevitable based on our history, but I believe that it's true.
I believe that as well. I mean, I believe to the point where it's almost predictable. The question becomes, unfortunately, how many mass shootings are going to happen before the end of the year? And what bothers me is how little our leaders want to deal with it. I mean, again, the political folks talk about it in the context of more police. More police. Police don't prevent violence. What they can do at best is come and, as a result of the violence, and investigate, maybe, put someone in jail as a result of it, but they don't prevent it from happening. So just adding more cops won't stop people from being violent. Hopefully, you can catch more killers, but they always end up catching the mass shooter anyway. I don't think it's a mass shooter that has ever done a mass shooting that ever got away. Either they commit suicide or they get arrested, but no mass shooter is still at large, just going around mass shooting people. He always gets caught in some way, in some form of fashion. So, but no one ever, like you talked about earlier, no one looks at and says, well, what can we change in our media, in our culture, in our mores, that can hopefully make small changes. And that's why I've given up on the belief that we can do this as a society. I believe that true change is only going to come when people who are in line with each other begin to start building together and start co-creating together and create within their own structure that world they want that exists. As Gandhi talks about, you creating the world we want. I think that's the only solution, to be honest. And I don't know if me being pessimistic from that context, but I just don't see the overall culture in America changing that way, because there's too many people who are locked in to violence and not enough people are seeing the necessity of growth, of what they can do to not be violent. Because as you talked about before, we even look at ourselves, what's interesting to me is how other human beings of the same species cannot see humanity in each other, but then they can see another species that's not human, but then empathize with that suffering of that animal, whether it's a dog or it's a cat or it's any other animal that has some form of intelligence. They can see empathy there. Like I've seen so many videos, when you get a dog, at least from my perspective, my journey down being a dog owner, I watch a lot of videos on YouTube, and I find myself really watching a lot of the videos that show rescue dogs. And, it's showing dogs in very horrific situations, being abandoned by their owners and being left out on the streets. And I see the folks coming, they rescue the dogs, they get the dogs cleaned up and things of that nature. And I'm saying, look at that. I don't see that same effort from humans. Of all the homeless people on the street, I don't see people saying, well, I just really rescued this homeless person off the street. I got him cleaned up. I make sure that he got, fed. We put him in a temporary bed. We got foster. There's no movement like that for human beings. If you're homeless, the most you're going to get from most people is a meal. And they have churches that's going to feed you and things of that nature. But changing your condition of homelessness is not going to happen on a grand scale. And that to me is just interesting. I'm not judging anybody. I don't judge the folks I think the people who actually do go out and rescue dogs or great folks who put forth that, because that does need to be done. But by the same token, I don't see how we can look past that human being that might be homeless 3 feet away and ignore that person and just save the dog and bring that stray dog into our homes, or get the dog cleaned up to the point that somebody comes and adopt that dog, where the human just has to sit there and just, well, that's just your choices in life. You just have to suffer those consequences.
Yeah, and that the last thing you said, I think, gets to the heart of it, because we do judge. We look at an animal and we just say, okay, they didn't choose this; that they were just abandoned, or they were, harmed or abused by some human. But we look at a human, and there's a tendency to, there are lots of judgments that are made. Well, how did he get homeless? What happened? And at what point did he decide to stop trying, or whatever the judgment might be. And that's that human piece where we judge each other, but we see the animals as, I don't know, I don't want to say this incorrectly, somehow lesser, but still deserving of love. So in other words, because animals don't have the same kind of free will that we do. But the judgment comes in. The guy's homeless. He must have done something wrong. It's horrible. But you use the word empathy as you were introducing that piece, talking about the animals versus the humans and how we respond to them, and that lack of empathy for those humans who some of us perceive as other than us is a big part of it. It helps us make it easier to dehumanize others, and then shoot them, drop bombs on them, whatever the violence happens to be. There was, another striking example shortly after September 11th, 2001, when the bill was before the Congress to give President Bush carte blanche in terms of going after the people responsible for hijacking the planes and taking down the towers and bombing and crashing into the Pentagon. A lot of folks in Congress, I'm going to just read one more short clip here, said something like this. This particular quote is from Representative Eric Cantor. He's no longer in Congress, but he was in office then. And I don't mean to pick on him, but he captured in a short statement what a lot of men and women in Congress, Democrat and Republican, said. And this is what he said. I rise today in support of this resolution. And the resolution was to authorize the use of United States armed forces against those responsible for the attacks. Right? So in support of this resolution, civilized society has long sought to end the use of violence. But the perpetrators of terrorism and states that harbor them are the enemies of civilized society. They only understand the use of force, and the time has come to speak with them on their terms. So Representative Cantor and most of the people in Congress said something similar, that the people who perpetrated violence against America on September 11, 2001 were not civilized because of their choice of using violence. Now, I don't know if I agree with, I don't think you have to characterize someone as being civilized or not civilized, because the 19 men involved were all educated and they were religious, as a lot of American politicians who wage war are educated
Right.
and religious.
Right.
So the idea that when somebody does that to us, they're not civilized, and yet we live in what's arguably and maybe literally the most violent culture in post-industrial democracies on the planet right now. And we're probably more violent than China is, but that's not a good comparison because of the rules there. They don't have much freedom either. But in terms of other free countries, I don't know of another one that comes close to the daily violence that we experience here. So who's civilized and who's not? And that's the shadow. Those people are uncivilized, and we're civilized, and now we have to fight back to them on their own terms using force. And that's almost comical. We've been doing that for 246 years.
Right.
The only nation that actually has decided to use nuclear weapons and did it on 2 cities where we incinerated women, men, and children. They weren't just military targets. We did it in the firebombing of Tokyo and Dresden during World War II. So the history of violence is there. And until we own that, recognize it, own it, and begin to integrate it, we're violent too, it will continue. And that's basic shadow one-on-one stuff. Until you recognize the shadow, own it, and begin to integrate it in a healthy way and say, I'm violent too. You're going to keep doing violent things because you think it's everybody else who's violent. And that's for me, the scariest piece of what we're talking about, this denial of the violence, because we think we're the good guys and everybody else is violent, and we're not.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's I would say the crux of the matter there is that our leadership falsely believes that we are the moral authority. So we have the ability to choose the right path. And like, for example, for me, I never understood why you would have more than one nuclear weapon. I mean, once you have one nuclear weapon that can go out here and decimate the area, why do you need to sit here and justify building multiple nuclear weapons? Because if it ever has become a nuclear war, you're not going to have an opportunity to send multiple weapons. It's going to come down to 3 or 4 weapons that get used, and the whole world is going to be decimated. Yeah. But it seems that just from the ego, when you talk about the shadow and you talk about the 9 different shadow elements, that makes us feel somewhat safer if we can say, well, we have more nuclear arms than you do, as though we'll get a chance to use all our nuclear arms that we have. Not to mention, should we want to, with the fact that we're not going to be able to, and so that's why I say, my quest is always looking at what can we do as individuals to just start making ourselves become more fully human along the journey. What information can we consume? I mean, even celebrating Halloween, like, for example, I know some folks will have a problem with me saying that, but we got to begin to really look at, do we really want to change and how our culture operates? Because, like, we tend to think that, well, don't eliminate the fun, but deal with the pain of the death. I mean, Halloween has become lately much more commercialized than it's ever been. Like, I started seeing, marketing for Halloween costumes right around the last part of August. And it's, letting you go, we go into fall. And then, like I saw on TV, so many different streaming channels, preparing for Scream Fest, and now it's all about, being scary and showing movies where everybody's been murdered, in some violent way, and we can talk about how many Friday 13th there's been. And then the need to kind of, once it's done, to resurface and come up with it for a new generation, because we're not satisfied with it. Same thing with Halloween, the movie franchise Halloween. So it's like Hollywood won't let us escape violence. It's going to be violence. And I have to admit, I enjoy watching movies that have violence in there because that's how I've been raised. I'm conditioned to be that way. I guess the older I'm getting, the less I'm interested in as much violence as I was when I was younger. Because to me, it was more like, well, if you're looking at it from an ingredient standpoint, well, you got to make sure violence is a main ingredient. Like you look at the back of a recipe, they say that first ingredient is the most dominant ingredient. That's what you look for. So violence, you look at the back of a movie, the movie had a list of ingredients. Violence would have to be number one. Then you can say comedy, drama, love, all those other things might come after that, but as long as it had violence. So I say all that to say is, until we really begin to ask ourselves, at what point is enough? Can we handle as a society 3 mass shootings in one day? Because we're able to handle multiple in 1 week. We're saying that. So the question becomes, can we handle multiple in 1 day? And then how many per day becomes too many for us to say, okay, we need to do something different now. And stop trying to run back to the Second Amendment. Stop trying to, hold on to what we believe to be rights that will be eliminated if we made certain changes. But at what point do we say something does have to change? And to me, that's the universal agreement I have yet to see. Yeah. Now, I heard people proposing different solutions, but we can't all agree that, number one, something has to be done differently. And I think until we can all universally say, as American citizens, that we have to do something differently, not necessarily knowing what it is, but at least can we agree at that fundamental level that something has to be done differently, and everybody can agree there. Then we can begin to start throwing out different options to say, well, should we reduce more gun? I mean, should we get, guns off the streets? Which I'm kind of torn in between that, because I get the logic of it, but then when you live in a city, as I do, as violent as Baltimore, all the criminals are still going to have guns. So what you're going to do is just get the guns out of the hands of the regular citizens who are not committing crimes at that level, who just want guns for protection. And I'm not an advocate for that. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that we should just get rid of all guns, but I think we should do a multiple approach to solving it. But I just want to get to the point, at least, can we agree that we need to do something different? We can't continue to live in the same way we live in and hoping somehow things would just change.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things you pointed to there. I mean, two of the other elements of shadow that you and I have been speaking about, besides violence in America, are greed and excess. And and it's a multifaceted issue. There's not one solution, but one of the things that I don't know if America will ever, if it has to come from the voters, but the amount of money that comes from corporate lobbyists across industries, gun manufacturers, pharmaceuticals, insurance, I mean, all of those industries, there are more lobbyists in Washington, D.C. than there are people in Congress. There's something like 700 or 800 lobbyists in D.C.
Right.
And there's, with the Senate, there's 500 some odd representatives in Congress, senators and Congress people. And a lot of people in Congress get campaign contributions from different industries, and they don't want to lose it. So money in politics is one issue. And this, I'm going to kind of be a little bit scattered here, but I want to put a few things on the table. So there's excess there. It's greed. You and I don't have at least I don't have a big say financially in what goes on. And yet, right now we're a couple of weeks away from the runoff election in Georgia for the Senate, the last Senate seat. And both the Republican machine and the Democratic machine send out emails to their constituents every day saying, we need another $40 some odd thousand by tonight's deadline because the other party has this much money and they're going to be able to put more ads on television. And that's been relentless since November 3rd, since Election Day.
Right.
We knew there was going to be a runoff. So constantly asking Americans like me, former Catholic school teacher and teaching poet, who for the first 35 years of his adult life didn't make more than $30,000, they're telling me every day that I need to send them money so they can buy ads on television and on streaming services so they can win. And the problem with that, now maybe I'm crazy, I just don't understand how it works, but the problem is, if the only way you can win, I don't care which side you're on, the only way you can win, and I'm definitely on one side or the other. I have a real strong opinion about if I were in Georgia who I would vote for, but that's not relevant to this conversation. If the only way you think you can win as a political party is through hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising, then that speaks to both the ignorance and the corruption of the ignorance of the citizens who are going to vote. Because if you're undecided in Georgia right now and you need a TV ad to convince you whether to vote for the Republican candidate or a Democratic candidate, then you're not a smart person. You're not. Sorry. And I don't mean to say that if you disagree with my choice, you're not smart. I mean, if you don't know who to vote for yet, and you need another several weeks of television ads and streaming ads, then you shouldn't even be, and I say this tongue in cheek, you shouldn't be allowed to vote. I mean, so I don't really mean it that way. So, but the money piece is huge. Whether we're talking about international violence when we bomb other countries, and the biggest piece of the federal budget is the military, the Defense Department, or, civilian versus civilian violence in our daily shootings. Weapons manufacturers and infrastructure manufacturers that make the weapons work, and they're among the most powerful lobbyists in the country, in the world, and we sell arms to countries that disagree with each other. So we, private citizens in the United States who run these companies, make money when war happens.
Absolutely.
And so do they want violence to end? Publicly, they probably have to say, well, we really don't want war, but we want to be ready for it, or whatever they say to that. But they and their shareholders get wealthy when we go to war, or when we insist we have to have more things in case we go to war. Mm-hmm. That's frightening, because we're just speaking about homeless people. And we're speaking about, we haven't spoken about inner city schools yet and comparing their funding to suburban schools.
Right.
But there's so much good use for money. And a lot of it goes towards lobbyists to major corporations, and many of which perpetrate violence around the world, or their tools are used to perpetrate violence. So and we don't own that. That's again the air we breathe. So it's a real complex mess. And I would say that it comes down to American citizens deciding what kind of country they want to live in, right? For the people who want to repress and attack anyone who's not white, cisgendered, heterosexual, male or female, which again includes, anybody of color, anybody that's not heterosexual. I hate to reduce it that way, but it's just easier to say it quickly that way. You want to spend your energy trying to point out that God only wants people to be heterosexual, or do you want to end violence? Where do you want to put your energy? That's just one example. And mostly we tend to vote metaphorically. I don't mean in the election booth, but we lean towards trying to correct people's lifestyle habits, and we don't do much or say much about the violence. Because there was a British journalist who back in 2012 or 2013 said out loud, the gun debate in America ended after Sandy Hook, when Congress proved that it was okay to shoot first graders, because they wouldn't pass any of the legislation on assault weapons and everything immediately thereafter. And that was a striking statement from outside of our culture, just looking in and saying, wow, even after 20 first graders get slaughtered with an assault weapon, the United States Congress won't change the laws. That's terrifying.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Well, to your point about, the lobbyists in D.C., I mean, K Street is infamously known as the street with all the lobbyists on, predominantly companies that have lobbyists have their buildings on K Street. And to your point about, our politicians, see, that's my question for the average American. At what point do you say enough is enough? Because the power is supposedly with the people, but then the politicians and our systems are designed to keep Americans, at a point where most people are asleep. And you're dealing with so much of trying to survive, either from your health issues, from your financial challenges, from your traumatic challenges of growing up and however you were growing up and you're raised, that you don't really have time to really delve deeper down into political analysis. So you just focus and vote on politicians based on surface level issues. Like the fact that they were willing to even put in legislation such as things as that if you were to say anything, even though we say we have free speech, but then if they were put this in several states that if you speak out against Israel, then the state has a right to not do business with you. And, and it's like, but they squeeze little legislation like that in because people are not aware, because of what we're just surviving is just such a tumultuous task nowadays.
Yeah.
So as we get near the top of the hour, what do you suggest are some of the ways that folks can now begin to, again, deal with these 9 elements of the American shadow and begin to weave our way to a more brighter future, I would hope?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm going to begin to answer by just quoting Krishnamurti, a quote attributed to him. And he didn't write it about America. He wrote it generally about humans. And I'm going to come close to saying it correctly, I hope. It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So if you're normal and healthy, you should be uncomfortable in American culture nowadays. Now, hopefully, You don't take that discomfort and get a gun and go shoot people. You channel your discomfort in positive, loving, kind ways. So I'm just, that's the foundation for my answer. So my answer is take a look at these 9 elements of shadow: ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, fear, violence, greed, excess, bullying, and untrustworthiness. I think I got all 9, but don't hate me if I only got 8. And rather than looking out at the country, all right, look out at yourself. Look in at yourself. And, how am I ignorant? How might I be arrogant? How might I be bigoted? How might I be fearful? And, just take a look at that. So begin to do the shadow work on yourself first and see how I might be contributing to this.
Well, thank you for that, Reggie. You seem to have your picture is frozen.
I know, I can see that. I'm not. So did the audio come through?
The audio came through. I can hear you very well.
Yeah, so I can see that I'm frozen. I don't know what happened there.
So you look like you're deep in thought there. So, but it froze at a good point because you're going. Like I said, your audio came through perfectly, so we heard exactly what you laid out.
Good.
And I just want to add this to that. That I think that, again, I'm a person that believes in creating new systems as a system engineer. And I think one of the things we need to do is, start to create more shows that show love and show serving. Like we have a show called American Horror Show, and that's fine. But we don't have a show that talks about American serving or American loving, and not love from a romantic context, because we have lots of comedies and rom-coms, as they call them. But I'm talking about love in the context of seeing other human beings and showing loveness and kindness and grace and helping shows that show that. And I know that it's not going to sell out and make billions of dollars initially, but just create a different atmosphere, different ways that people can unwind and unpack beyond just watching the violence to get away or escape the violence in real life. You watch violence in the movies to escape that, but your mind still is getting hit with all the violence. It's never ending. And that's what I hope we can get to the point where we can begin to start having alternatives. So if folks still want to choose to live in a culture where violence consumes them and their music and their movies they watch and the books they read and the conversations they have and what they feed their minds all the way around the news, that there's also an alternative of more alternatives of folks who want to consume information on love, on serving, of co-creating, of living a much more fulfilled life. And that's the world I want to create. And I hope others want to join in that endeavor.
Yeah, thank you for that. I agree. I mean, media that shows us love and compassion and mercy and those qualities of being human, as opposed to what can happen to a human body when it gets hit by a automatic weapon round or whatever the show happens to be, or some make-believe horror devil stuff, but just reinforcing the humanity of humans. So I agree 100%. I really appreciate your saying that.
And well, thank you for that. And as we reached 5 minutes before we have to end today's show, right before our national holiday of Thanksgiving, which tends to be the one holiday everyone can agree with that people love to get together on, because it's really more about family, more so than anything else. That I want to talk about, who do you see, Reggie, as your example of someone who exhibiting or has exhibited the fully human behavior characteristics that we are advocating for?
Yeah. So 2 things. I mean, there are some people I know who, indigenous peoples of the North Americas, who aren't as crazy about how we celebrate Thanksgiving. Although, most of people I know are just grateful for what they have in their lives now. But but I agree with you that it's one place where we can stop and be grateful for our lives. But I want to just somebody I didn't know about last week, but I just want to point to retired Major Richard Fierro, an Army veteran, who was the man who stopped the shooter at Club Q in Colorado Springs this past, Saturday night. And he was there with his wife and his daughter and his daughter's boyfriend. And the shooting started, and he ducked down and he got up and he saw the shooter, and he pulled him down and disabled him and probably saved countless lives. And he was just grieving. So he had the ability as a strong, courageous human being to take down a shooter with no gun of his own, but also had the humanity and the gentleness to cry because he couldn't save 5 people who died, one of whom was his daughter's boyfriend. So one of the people he was there with that night was one of the victims. So he just kind of embodied this. He was pushed into it. He didn't choose it, but he did choose to act. So in terms of being fully human, and I found that he brought the full spectrum of humanity to what he did, and then the attention that came to him, which he didn't really want, but he granted some interviews. So, I had a deep bow of respect and gratitude to Richard Fierro, I think is how you would say the name.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he was also a vet, so he had that training. So, but you're absolutely right. Yeah. It takes a lot to, be able to persevere through those kind of situations and still do something for someone else and not only concern yourself with self-protection, And my fully human choice would have to be, I'm going to go back in history and choose Booker T. Washington.
Okay.
And I choose him primarily because, again, I look for folks in history who, despite the horrific circumstances they had to deal with, coming up as a slave and not growing up and using that experience to have hatred in his heart, but use his energy and his creativity and his resilience to go on, get an education. I can't imagine, most people can't even fathom what the mindset of a slave must have been in that time frame. But then to have the desire at such a level that you want an education, so you're willing to walk hundreds of miles and sleep under bar porches until you get to the point where you try to fight your way into school, not fight physically, but fight the challenges and the obstacles you have to overcome to get into college, where he had to be a gentleman who had to come in as a janitor. And he said, my goal was to be the best janitor there was, because he took every opportunity as a way to get to his goals, to accomplish his goals, get through his college, get his degree, and then eventually open up Tuskegee University and even built that college from scratch and inspired the students when they didn't even have bricks enough to build the college. He actually had to build the college physically, with taking bricks and mortar. And when they didn't have enough bricks, they went and made bricks. So they never let anything stop them from achieving their goal, because he understood what he was working towards had a higher purpose, and he tapped into that, as we talked about earlier in the show, that meaning that Viktor Frankl refers to, that when you lock into your meaning in life, nothing, no obstacle that's on this earth can stop you from achieving your goal. So when you put others before yourself, when you sacrifice greatly, that to me is when you tap into the empathy and the emotional intelligence of what it takes to become fully human and make those fully human connections that we are advocating.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for that, King.
Well, thank you again for another wonderful show. And again, like I said before, writing a book that you've written that was timely, necessary. hopefully we get this more into the American culture, which is one of the reasons we do the show, so that we can get these kind of discussions into the lexicon of our culture in America, so we can all question the narratives that are here throughout our history and look for ways to become more fully human.
Yeah.
So until next Wednesday, definitely want to wish everyone a wonderful Thanksgiving tomorrow, a happy holidays this whole entire weekend. Hopefully we can not have any mass shootings, or anyone hopefully doesn't get caught up in violence, and people can get with their families and enjoy this holiday as best as we can. And by God's grace, we'll all be back here next Wednesday having another discussion on how we can continue to explore the methods of how to become fully human.
Amen.
Well, thank you, listening audience, to listen to today's show. Until next Wednesday, wish everyone a blessed and productive day. And again, Reggie, thank you for joining me on today's show as well.
You are welcome. Thank you, King.